A mother grizzly bear, desperate and trembling, steps out of the dense forest. Her massive frame blocks the narrow path, but she isn't here to attack, she's here to beg for help. Ethan Walker, a dedicated veterinarian, had always felt a connection with animals, but nothing could have prepared him for this moment. A wild grizzly, one of nature's most powerful creatures, was pleading with him, her eyes filled with a silent desperation he couldn't ignore. He knew the risks. Approaching a bear in distress could be deadly. But something in him told him to follow. And when he finally saw what she was leading him to, his heart nearly stopped. A tiny cub, trapped in the raging river, tangled in an old fishing net, drowning, dying. Ethan had only seconds to act. But would the mother trust him enough to let him save her baby? And if he failed, would she turn on him? This story will challenge everything you know about the bond between humans and animals. Stay with us, because what happens next is truly unforgettable. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Ethan Walker had always felt at home in the wilderness. A seasoned veterinarian who had spent years treating injured wildlife, he had seen his fair share of suffering. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to face. After an exhausting week at the Animal Rescue Center, Ethan decided to escape the city's chaos and retreat to his isolated cabin deep in the Montana wilderness. Nestled among towering pine trees, the cabin provided him with the solitude he needed to recharge. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the crisp mountain air fill his lungs. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had chosen this life, away from the noise, away from the rush. Just him and the raw beauty of nature. He had just stepped onto the worn path leading to the river when something felt off. A strange stillness hung in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The usual rustling of the trees and distant calls of birds had vanished. Then he heard it, a deep, guttural sound, low and distressed. Ethan froze. His pulse quickened as he scanned the tree line. And then, emerging from the shadows, she appeared. A massive grizzly bear stood just a few yards away. Instinct screamed at him to back away. Every muscle in his body tensed as he kept his hands raised, trying to appear non-threatening. He knew the dangers all too well. Grizzlies were unpredictable, especially mothers. But then he saw her eyes. They weren't filled with aggression, they were filled with fear. Ethan's breath hitched. He had never seen a bear look desperate. Then, just behind her, a small, trembling cub emerged. The moment his eyes landed on the tiny creature, his stomach sank. Something was wrong. The mother bear turned and began walking away. But then she stopped. She turned her massive head back to Ethan and waited. It was an invitation. She wanted him to follow. Ethan hesitated. Every survival instinct told him this was insane. Following a wild grizzly bear into the unknown? That was suicide. But then he saw the way she glanced back at him, her body tense with urgency. This wasn't an ambush. This was a plea. And he couldn't ignore it. Gritting his teeth, Ethan took a slow step forward. Then another. His heartbeat thundered in his chest as he followed her deeper into the forest, his mind racing with possibilities. Then, through the thick underbrush, he saw it. A second cub. Trapped. The tiny bear was caught in the strong currents of the river, tangled in a web of discarded fishing nets. The water surged over its small body, dragging it under before it barely managed to resurface, gasping for air. Ethan's stomach clenched. The cub was drowning. And the mother bear, she was begging him to save her baby. Would she trust him enough to let him help? Or had Ethan just walked straight into a life-or-death situation? He had seconds to decide. Ethan's mind worked at lightning speed. He had to act now. The cub was seconds away from slipping under the surface for good. The mother bear stood frozen at the river's edge, her massive paws shifting anxiously on the damp ground. She wanted to help, but she didn't know how. Her deep growls echoed across the water, a heartbreaking mix of helplessness and urgency. Ethan clenched his jaw. There was no time to think, only to act. He threw off his jacket and sprinted toward the riverbank, his boots slipping on the wet earth. The icy wind cut through his skin, but adrenaline dulled the sensation. The cub fought to keep its head above water, its tiny paws thrashing against the suffocating grip of the tangled fishing net. Each second that passed was a second closer to drowning. Ethan didn't hesitate. He plunged into the freezing river. A shockwave of cold shot through his body. His breath caught in his throat. His muscles tensed, and for a brief moment he felt paralyzed. But then the urgency hit him again. He had no choice but to push forward. Fighting against the current, he swam toward the cub, each stroke an exhausting battle against the icy water. His fingers felt numb, his limbs sluggish, but he forced himself forward. As he reached the cub, his heart clenched. The tiny creature had almost stopped moving, its exhausted body barely struggling anymore. "Come on, buddy. Stay with me." With trembling hands, Ethan grabbed at the thick fishing net wrapped around the cub's frail body. It was wound tight, too tight. The cub let out a weak whimper, its tiny eyes flickering between fear and surrender. "No. I won't let this happen." Gritting his teeth, Ethan pulled at the tangled mess, but it was impossible to tear with his hands alone. He needed something sharp, fast. His eyes darted around desperately, and then he saw it, a ragged rock protruding from the riverbed. Without thinking, he lunged for it, scraping his hands in the process. He ignored the pain and started sawing at the thick net, the rough stone cutting into his fingers as he worked. The mother bear stood on the riverbank watching, her deep brown eyes never leaving him. She didn't growl. She didn't step forward. She just waited. Ethan didn't know what terrified him more, the fact that he was inches away from a wild grizzly bear or the crushing responsibility of saving her child. Finally, one rope snapped. Then another. The cub stirred, suddenly realizing it could move again. Ethan freed the last knot just as a surge of the river's current hit them both. He barely had time to react before he was swept underwater, the force pulling him down with the cub in his arms. Cold darkness swallowed him whole. He kicked, his lungs screaming for air. He had to get the cub out. With the last of his strength, he pushed up toward the surface, breaking through just in time. The mother bear let out a deep roar as she watched him drag her baby toward the shore. Ethan crawled onto the riverbank, gasping, drenched, and shaking. The cub lay motionless beside him, its tiny chest barely rising and falling. Was he too late? The mother bear took one step closer. Ethan barely had the energy to react. If she decided to attack now, he wouldn't stand a chance. But she didn't. Instead, she nudged her cub gently with her nose, a soft, pleading sound escaping her throat. Seconds passed. Then a choked gasp left Ethan's lips as relief crashed over him. The little one was alive. The mother bear let out a deep, rumbling noise, almost like a purr. Then, carefully, she picked up her cub by the scruff of its neck and turned back toward the forest. Ethan sat there, chest heaving, watching them disappear into the trees. He had just done something no man should ever attempt. And yet, somehow, he had survived. Ethan sat on the damp riverbank, his breath uneven, his hands still trembling from the effort. Every fiber of his body ached, but none of that mattered. He had just saved a life. A wild life. As the grizzly mother disappeared into the dense forest with her cub, Ethan felt an inexplicable weight press against his chest. Would he ever see them again? He wanted to believe that they had shared a moment of understanding, that, in some way, the mother bear had trusted him enough to save her child. Yet reality set in. He was just a man who had nearly drowned in a frozen river. Shivering, Ethan pushed himself up, his soaked clothes heavy against his skin. He needed to get back to the cabin before the cold got the better of him. With weak steps, he stumbled his way through the trees, his mind still replaying the moment the cub gasped for air. Inside the warmth of his cabin, Ethan sat by the crackling fireplace, wrapped in a thick blanket yet still unable to shake the cold inside him. Not the cold from the river, but the emptiness. Had he done enough? Would the cub survive the night? Was the mother bear strong enough to care for both of her young ones? The questions swirled inside his head, each one heavier than the last. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. A storm was rolling in. If he had been even an hour later, the cub would have never stood a chance. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. A sudden thump outside broke the silence. Ethan sat up immediately, his senses sharpening. It wasn't the wind. Something was outside. His heartbeat quickened. Could it be the mother bear? Slowly, he reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, not to use it, but as a precaution. He stepped toward the window and carefully peered through the frost-covered glass. What he saw made his breath hitch. A shadow stood at the edge of the tree line. Ethan's chest tightened. He knew those eyes, deep brown and unmistakable. It was her. The mother bear. She was watching him. His grip on the rifle loosened as he let out a slow breath. She wasn't charging. She wasn't growling. She was waiting. But for what? Ethan didn't dare move. He simply stood there, frozen in place, locking eyes with the massive creature. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the mother bear let out a low guttural sound, not aggressive, not a warning, something else. She turned, vanishing into the darkness of the forest, and just like that, she was gone. Ethan's pulse pounded. What had just happened? Why had she come back? And most importantly, would she return again? Ethan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, the grizzly mother standing at the edge of the woods, watching him. Why had she come back? The question gnawed at his mind as he sat at his small wooden table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. Through the window, the first light of dawn bathed the snow-covered forest in soft hues of blue and gold. He considered the facts. Bears don't thank humans. They don't seek them out. They survive. They avoid. So why had she stood there, looking at him? Was she making sure he wasn't a threat? Was she warning him to stay away? Or had she trusted him? The thought sent a chill down his spine, not of fear, but of something deeper, something unspoken between man and beast. But if he had learned anything in life, it was that nature didn't owe him an explanation. After finishing his coffee, Ethan put on his boots and stepped outside. The air was crisp, filled with the distant sound of birds waking with the sun. And then he saw them. Track's huge paw prints leading away from his cabin, disappearing into the thick trees. His heart pounded as he followed them, his instincts taking over. This wasn't over yet. The deeper into the forest he went, the quieter the world became. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath his boots and the occasional snap of a branch. After a few minutes, he slowed his pace. Up ahead, something caught his eye, a disturbance in the snow. His stomach tightened as he approached, his breath misting in the icy air. And then his heart nearly stopped. Lying there, barely visible beneath a thin layer of snow, was the injured cub. Ethan's pulse pounded. How had this happened? Had he been too weak to keep up with his mother? Had the storm been too much? Kneeling beside the small bear, Ethan hesitated. His body was still, too still. His breath caught as he reached out and touched the cub's fur. Still warm. And then, to his relief, a weak inhale. The cub was alive, but barely. Ethan didn't have time to hesitate. If he left him here, he wouldn't make it through the night. Ignoring every survival instinct telling him to never interfere with wildlife, Ethan carefully lifted the cub into his arms. The little bear was lighter than he expected, its breathing shallow, its body limp. He didn't know if this was the right thing to do. He didn't know if the mother bear would come back looking for her cub. But he couldn't just leave him here. Taking a deep breath, Ethan turned around and began the long walk back to his cabin. Behind him, hidden in the trees, a pair of deep brown eyes watched every step he took. Ethan's breath came out in sharp clouds as he hurried through the snow, the cub cradled in his arms. The little bear was barely moving, its small body too cold, too weak. Every few steps, Ethan could feel the cub's chest rise and fall, slow and fragile, like a candle flickering in the wind. His cabin wasn't far, but with every second that passed, doubt crept into his mind. Was this a mistake? Taking a wild animal, a grizzly cub, no less, into his home went against everything he had ever been taught. But this wasn't a case of reckless interference. This was survival. If he didn't act now, the cub would die. The door slammed shut behind him as he stepped into the warmth of the cabin. Ethan moved quickly, placing the cub near the fireplace, layering it with blankets, and rubbing its fur gently to generate warmth. After a few minutes, the cub let out a faint sound, a weak, barely audible whimper. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "He's fighting," he whispered to himself. He reached for a clean rag, soaking it in warm water before carefully wiping away the ice and dirt from the cub's fur. Its tiny paws twitched, its breathing steadied, but he knew this was just the beginning. The cub needed more than warmth. It needed nutrition, hydration. Ethan didn't have milk substitute for bear cubs, but he did have honey, oats, and a bit of water. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. As he mixed the ingredients, he heard it. A low, distant sound from outside. A sound that made his entire body go still. A deep, mournful growl. Ethan turned toward the window, his pulse hammering in his ears. Through the trees, just beyond the clearing, a shadow moved. It was her. The grizzly mother. Ethan's stomach twisted. She had followed them. And now, she was calling for her cub. His hands tightened around the bowl he had been holding. This was not how he had planned for things to go. Would she come for the cub? Would she attack to get him back? His mind raced through possibilities, but deep down, he knew one thing. She hadn't harmed him before. She had led him to the cub. She had trusted him once. But trust only went so far. Slowly, Ethan placed the bowl down, his eyes never leaving the trees. The mother bear stood there, barely visible in the dim light, watching. Waiting. For the first time, Ethan wasn't just afraid. He understood. She wasn't there to attack. She was pleading. And in that moment, Ethan knew exactly what he had to do. Ethan's breath hitched as he stepped toward the window, his eyes locked on the silhouette in the trees. The mother bear hadn't left. Her large form was barely visible under the moonlight, but her presence was undeniable. Watching. Waiting. She had followed them through the storm. She had tracked them. And now, she stood there, expecting something. Ethan looked at the small cub beside the fire. Its breathing had steadied, but it was still weak, too weak to leave just yet. Yet the longer he kept the cub, the more dangerous this situation became. Ethan knew that stepping outside was a gamble. The mother bear wasn't like a dog waiting patiently for its owner to return. She was a grizzly, a predator. A desperate mother. And a mother's desperation could turn to aggression in an instant. Still, he knew he couldn't keep the cub inside forever. With a deep breath, he grabbed his heavy coat and boots, wrapped the cub in a thick blanket, and slowly pushed the cabin door open. The freezing wind bit his face as he stepped out, every muscle tense with anticipation. He didn't walk too close. Instead, he placed the cub gently on the snow near the porch, taking a few slow steps back. And then he waited. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The forest was silent. The mother bear remained where she was, her breath visible in the cold air. Then, slowly, she moved forward. Ethan's heart pounded as her massive paws crunched against the snow. Would she take her cub and leave, or would she see him as a threat and attack? He didn't move. Didn't even blink. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to run inside. But then something incredible happened. The grizzly mother reached the cub and nudged it gently with her nose. The small bear let out a weak cry, one that sent a visible shudder through the mother's body. She licked its fur, warming it with her breath, checking for injuries. Then, for the first time, she lifted her head and looked directly at Ethan. Ethan didn't know what he expected, a warning growl, an aggressive stance. Instead, she stared. Not with rage. Not with fear. But with something else. Something he never thought he'd see in the eyes of a wild grizzly. Understanding. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silent exchange between them felt longer than time itself. And then, as if she had made a decision, the mother bear lowered her head and began to gently nudge the cub forward. They were leaving. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He had done what he could. He had given the cub warmth, a fighting chance. But now, nature would take its course. As the mother and cub disappeared into the snowy trees, Ethan let out a long, shaky breath. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a moment of trust between two species that were never meant to understand each other, a connection Ethan would never forget. Ethan didn't sleep much that night. Even after the mother bear and her cub disappeared into the frozen forest, he couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head. That silent exchange. That look in her eyes. That unspoken understanding. For years, he had treated animals, saving lives through medicine and science. But this was different. This wasn't about medical skills. This was about trust. As dawn broke, Ethan stepped outside, his boots sinking into the thick snow. The storm had calmed, leaving behind a landscape untouched by time. But near his cabin, there was evidence of what had happened the night before. Tracks. Large, powerful paw prints led away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees. But then, something made him pause. A second set of tracks. Smaller. Weaker. But walking alongside the first. The cub had made it. Ethan exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It was alive. And somehow, he knew it was because of him. He stood there for a long time, staring at those tracks. The wilderness was an unforgiving place. Not all animals got second chances. But last night, he had given one small creature a fighting chance. And in return, he had received something he never expected. A moment of connection with one of nature's most powerful creatures. Not as a veterinarian. Not as a human intruding in the wild. But simply as one being helping another. Just as he turned back toward the cabin, a strange feeling washed over him. He looked toward the tree line, and then he saw it. Far in the distance, a figure stood among the trees, the grizzly mother. She wasn't close, wasn't moving toward him. She was just watching. For a few seconds, she remained still, her dark eyes locking onto his. Then, without a sound, she turned and vanished into the forest. And somehow, Ethan knew this wasn't a warning. This wasn't fear. This was a farewell. As Ethan walked back inside, he felt something deep within him shift. He had always loved animals, always fought for their survival. But this experience had changed him. He wasn't just a veterinarian anymore. He was someone who understood what it meant to be trusted by the wild. And that was something he would carry for the rest of his life. As Ethan sat on the wooden steps of his cabin that evening, he couldn't shake off the image of the mother bear leading him to her drowning cub. In that moment, he realized something profound. Animals understand more than we think. The grizzly mother had made a choice. She had put her trust in him, a human. Despite the history of fear and danger between their species, she had seen his kindness. And in return, he had witnessed something few people ever do, the raw, undeniable bond between a mother and her child, even in the wild. Ethan had spent his life healing animals, but this experience was different. This time, an animal had reached out for help. And in doing so, she had reminded him why he chose this path in the first place. As he watched the grizzly family disappear into the forest, he felt something deep inside him shift. No matter how many challenges came his way, he knew one thing for certain: he would never stop fighting for those who had no voice. If this story inspired you, remember, courage and compassion can overcome any challenge. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who loves heartfelt stories like this one.